You're listening to Overdoing It, the Rhode Island Library Podcast. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Overdoing It, where our team of library workers dish about their latest reads, views, and passions, alongside fascinating conversations with local, and for this episode, not so local, luminaries. I'm your host, Zach Berger, branch librarian at the William Hall Library in Cranston, Rhode Island, and my pronouns are he, him. Let's dive in and discover who our guests are today.
Hi, I'm Madelyn Shaw, and I'm a Cranston person, although not a native. I'm a curator and writer, and mostly working with textiles and dress and international implications of trade and commerce and stuff.
And I'm Trish FitzSimons, here with you from a part of the world where the name of this podcast would be pronounced Overdoing It. The pun wouldn't quite work, but there you go. I am a documentary filmmaker and a writer with a passion for history that's also dabbled a little bit in exhibition making, but I defer to Madelyn's expertise as a curator, and I'm an adjunct professor of Griffith Film School, Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia.
Well, welcome to you both. And in case you can't tell, Trish is joining us all the way from Australia, and we thank you for getting up early to be able to do that.
Actually, I thank you for organising this podcast, so it's not too early.
Well, it's our pleasure. And a little bit later in the show, we will talk to Trish and Madelyn about their fascinating new book, FLEECED, Unraveling the History of Wool and War, which was published earlier this year by Rowman and Littlefield. But before we get to that, let's start out as we always do with, what have you been reading?
Well, I have to say that you're going to think that we coordinated this, but I only found out today what book Trish was talking about. And I have actually been reading off and on for some weeks Václav Havel's Disturbing the Peace, which is a series of interviews with him, edited and transcribed. It has so much to offer today that it's really quite remarkable. I do alternate that because it's very serious and very thoughtful with some P.G. Wodehouse, because reading something like, she resembled a tomato struggling for self-expression, just has to make you laugh. And that's essential right now.
Yes, indeed. And Trish?
I've just finished reading Matthew Longo's The Picnic, An Escape to Freedom and the Collapse of the Iron Curtain. I saw him speak at the Adelaide Writers' Festival in South Australia earlier this year, and he was fabulous, and I bought his book, but I've only just read it. It's about Hungary and East Germany in the months of 1989 leading up to the collapse of the Iron Curtain. And it's about kind of history coming towards you and sort of smacking you in the face. So The Picnic was a mob of Hungarian activists oppositional to the communist regime organising a huge picnic on the border between Hungary and Austria, where they wanted to sort of celebrate the longer Austro-Hungarian history. But things were starting to kind of open up in Hungary. So their plan was to, have a big picnic, go home and see what happened. But meanwhile, things were diabolical in the GDR, East Germany, and East Germans were streaming through Czechoslovakia to Hungary. So suddenly, a little gate that would allow some Austrians to come through and have a picnic is being absolutely charged by East Germans desperate to get out, amongst a whole lot of other things, including, of course, Gorbachev and Nemeth, then the Hungarian Prime Minister. It kind of barely 2 months later, the Iron Curtain has collapsed. Now, I didn't read this book with any connection to wool at all, but it's actually so relevant to chapter 8 of our book and the forces that came together to offer a big kind of slap in the face, for want of better words, to the Australian wool industry in ways that it's never quite recovered from, and understanding how nobody could quite understand how quickly all of those things were going to change. It's fascinating.
That does sound very interesting. I've been reading one of my favorite fiction writers. His name is Jess Walter. And one of my favorite books of all time is Beautiful Ruins. And that is something that I've reread a number of times, and tells the story of a young man who has a pensione on the coast in Italy and wonders why this Hollywood ingenue is shuttled by boat to his pensione, and he learns that she has been working on a major film project in Rome with a very famous Hollywood actor. So you learn throughout the book what their relationship turns into. And that takes place in I think it's the late 50s, early 60s. And simultaneously, there is another narrative that tells the story of a woman who's struggling to make it in Hollywood as a producer. And slowly the two stories merge. As I said, that's one of my favorite books of all time. And so I have made it a mission to read other works by Jess Walter. So the book that I most recently read by him is called We Live in Water, which is a collection of short stories. It was published in 2013. And these are some very gritty tales, mostly set in the Pacific Northwest, about people on the margins, junkies, criminals, deadbeat dads, but written in such a way that no character feels like a trope. I listened to the audiobook twice, once myself, and then when my husband and I were going on a road trip, I made him listen to it with me so I could listen to it again, and he loved it too. And then I read the print book as well, and then I went back and re-listened to my 3 favorite stories and reread my 3 favorite stories. That's how impactful this writing was for me. So I highly recommend that book for those who like shorter fiction.
You make me want to. I've written down Jess Walter, Beautiful Ruins. I haven't got the name of the short stories, but it sounds fabulous.
Yes, and that collection is called We Live in Water.
Right.
So what have you been watching?
I shudder to actually admit this, but I've been watching reruns of the 1960s series The Avengers. For Escape. It's wonderful. Mm-hmm. It's really funny.
Mm-hmm.
I've been late to series television, but I've been watching with my husband the 3rd series of The Diplomat, Deborah Cohn. So that's the American series called The Diplomat, that's based on a US diplomat in Britain and all the kind of the machinations of her life and times. We enjoy it very much. I don't know whether you call it a political thriller, but anyway, it's very engaging, and right up until the 3rd series, we're still kind of staying with it.
It seems like there are too many viewing options these days.
I miss the days when you just saw something and everybody watched the same thing and then you talked about it the next day. I've missed that.
Yeah. There was a lot of advantage to making that a viewing pattern that worked in a more leisurely fashion, I think. Now there are so many options, and there are a number of shows that I've been watching. But the one that I wanted to mention for this episode is one that maybe not a lot of people have heard about, and it is one of my sort of mindless escape routes when I need something that's just benign, pleasurable, and it's called Portrait Artist of the Year. It's a British series. It's like a reality TV competition kind of show, very much in the spirit of the Great British Bake Off.
Mm-hmm.
And so it involves artists who have submitted self-portraits to see if they will be one of the lucky ones chosen for an episode. There are 9 artists in each episode, and the 9 artists are then split up into groups of 3. And each group of 3 then, during the show, paints a portrait of a British celebrity. And they have 4 hours to make this painting. And they use all kinds of media. Some, use oil paints, watercolors, acrylics. There are some collagists occasionally, printmakers, and so on. So it's a lot of fun to watch them ply their craft. And at the end of the episode, the judges make a short list of 3, and then they narrow down the short list to a winner. And that winner will move on to the semifinals, where the whole process is repeated with another group of celebrities. And then there's one winner at the very end of the season who is commissioned to paint a portrait of someone really famous and wins £10,000. And the portrait will then hang in a national gallery or museum somewhere. So it's a lot of fun. It's very formulaic. If you watch enough episodes, you can tell who's going to say what at which time and when they're going to, swing from this particular focus to the next one. But it's a lot of fun watching the artists work and watch them interact with the celebrities that they're painting. So I enjoy that. So as we mentioned at the start of the show, our guests, Trish FitzSimons and Madelyn Shaw, are the authors of FLEECED, Unraveling the History of Wool and War. I'd love it if one or both of you could give our listeners an overview of what the book is about to start, and then I have some questions for you, but perhaps we'll also have you read a short excerpt.
Well, our little elevator sentence is that FLEECED is the backstory as to why we're all drowning in polyester microfibers. In fact, Trish and I met because she saw a Civil War sesquicentennial exhibition that I had worked on that was traveling around the country, and she saw it at the New York Historical Society 11 years ago, Trish, and tracked me down, and we talked about it. She had been reading letters that her grandfather, who was a wool buyer in Australia, had written to his parents from the U.S. In about 1905, 6, 7, when he was learning the wool business over here. So we talked, and we just decided that wool didn't get enough credit as a kind of mover and shaker in wartime. So we started working, researching together, and then after a few years, and we did papers and presentations and stuff, we realized that it wasn't just about wool, that the stuff that we were learning about how Britain controlled most of the world's wool, at least the world's garment wool, because of the Southern Hemisphere colonies and because of its shipping, and how the sort of wool have-not nations, really beginning in World War I, started looking for replacements, for synthetics, something to substitute for wool. So that kind of opened up a bigger can of worms for us, added several years to our project, research timing. But we've had an extraordinary 10 years of collaboration, and we think the book was written for a general audience, but our publisher was perfectly fine with us having a lot of footnotes. So if you want to look it up, it's in there. Trish, you want to add anything to that?
Just to add a little bit, I think this book that we've written, no single individual could have written. And that's one of its kind of real strengths, because me coming from the perspective of Australia, and specifically from the perspective of the granddaughter of a wool buyer who was one of multi-generational wool buyers, Madelyn, literally from the heart of what was the great New England wool industry, as well as, her huge depth of knowledge of textile history. It was kind of like this book is what two women with separate but related and I think compatible and complementary knowledges can come up with together. And indeed, it's been a huge pleasure. I, for one, have learned more from this project than ever I could have imagined.
Ditto.
Well, thank you for giving us that synopsis. Madelyn, would you like to read a brief excerpt to give our listeners a taste?
Sure. I came up with a couple of different ones, but I think the one that I'm going to read is from the preface. The wool industry has been transnational for centuries, becoming even more so once the factory mechanization of creating woolen textiles met the newly productive Southern Hemisphere sheep markets in the first half of the 19th century. But it has tended to be understood partially from the perspective of whichever nation is telling the story. In Australia, this means that wool industry refers to sheep pastoralism, the primary production of woolen fiber. There are occasional nods to the global wool market based there, but little focus on who used all that wool or why. In the United States, which had both substantial sheep pastoralism and a woolen textile manufacturing capacity rivaled only by the UK, wool's story has essentially faded from view, overshadowed in American history by another textile fiber, cotton. We found that many different kinds and degrees of warfare arose in relation to sheep and wool, not all confined to battlefields. Land wars between indigenous inhabitants and the colonist invaders who wanted their land to raise sheep occurred in many parts of the world. The western United States saw range wars erupt between cattlemen and sheepmen who wanted to run their animals on the open ranges, which couldn't support both. Additional complications, sometimes involving physical violence, arose in decades of strife between labor and capital, while the business and economic warfare of industrial espionage, the metaphorically cutthroat business of buying and brokering wool, and the constantly changing tariff laws sparked discord not only between companies, but among countries and even between manufacturers and primary producers within countries. Behind those fluffy, fleecy mounds of wool fiber lies much that is not warm and fuzzy.
Thank you, Madelyn. Before we start digging in a little bit more, I'd like to ask you, how did you work out the complexities of doing research from two opposite parts of the world?
Trish, we get asked that question a lot. And the thing that Trish says is thousands of emails.
But I think, and thousands of emails and marking up and downloading those emails and their attachments is certainly one key method to what could be described as our madness. But I would also say this project has hugely benefited from fellowships from both sides of the Pacific. So Madelyn came to Australia first with a fellowship from my university, Griffith University, then on a senior Fulbright, and then a National Library of Australia fellowship, each of those being for several weeks. I came to the US on a Queensland Government Smithsonian fellowship for about 6 weeks. And I'd originally been on, when I met Madelyn, I was on research leave. So periods of being together, intensely and working together. And this book is underpinned by actually an enormous amount of what I call quest travel. We have separately and together been to so many of the places that we write about in this book, York in England, Ypres, and places around, the Western Front in Belgium. We've been to Hagley and Delaware and the archives through which one can find out much about the history of synthetics. We've been to Tasmania and Victoria and New South Wales and their sheep growing regions and their cities and wool stores.
And lots of manufacturers, both in Australia and, the manufacturers that we can find here still. That's one of the strengths of the book is that it brings in a lot of different places and a lot of different people, a lot of different stories, and how they are all connected. And making those connections has been really important to us.
And I think, too, I'll leave Madelyn to talk about objects and collections in museums, but I have a sort of around a 40-year history. Interview has been absolutely central to my way of working. And what we realized early on is that the wool trade historically, for many centuries, and certainly intensely since the 19th century, has had families. You know, in the US, the Hobbs and Stevens family are two that come immediately to mind, that are intricately connected over several generations to New England wool history. I think I briefly mentioned that my own family is a family of wool buyers, but we then found wool buyers between Yorkshire, Australia, and the US. There's an Aboriginal family that has 7 generations of being absolutely central to the Australian wool growing industry. There's a German wool buying family, the Lohmann, Waldhausens, Nolteniuses, that has connections between Germany, New England, and Australia. So we couldn't possibly make a definitive, complete history of wool and war in the last couple of centuries. Breaking it down, having like indicative case studies has been one key method. Over to you, Madelyn, to talk about object.
When we first started, we thought we were going to develop a kind of exhibition that would travel, but what would travel would be sort of templates for labels and text panels and films. And we did actually produce, well, Trish produced one finished film and 3 short films that have not been finished. So we started looking at objects in museums all around the world, and helped immensely by collections that are online. When we started with the book, we decided that we wanted to open each chapter with some object that related to and would help readers sort of get into the content of each chapter. And that was really tough because we had hundreds and hundreds of objects to consider. And, but in the end, I think we liked what we chose. So I think they're all pretty representative and useful for people to understand where we're going.
As a reader, that works. It's a very effective intro to each chapter. And you mentioned a little while ago about the importance of all of these connections. And there's a doozy of a set of connections right at the very beginning. On page 4, you write about an anecdote involving Mark Twain, Cecil Rhodes, a fisherman, a shark. And I'm sorry if this sounds like a setup for a walked into a bar joke. That's not my intention. And a fragment of newspaper found in the shark's belly that reveals the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War. It's such an unlikely but fascinating bit of storytelling. Can you tell our listeners more about how you discovered this tidbit of information and why you decided to include it?
Well, I'm kind of a Mark Twain freak. So I knew about that from having read the book, Following the Equator, I think it is. And Trish found that there was a Queensland politician who, during the Crimean War, actually had done something similar, had not found noticed that the war had broken out in the stomach of a shark, but had tried to buy up all of the Queensland wool and then ship it back to England so that he could make a killing during the Crimean War. Unfortunately, the war ended before much of his wool got the 3 months that it took in a sailing ship to get from Australia to London. So when we were talking about these two different things, and we thought, Mark Twain was traveling in Australia, and maybe he heard that story and kind of decided he was going to make it, his own and twist it around to make up this little fable about Cecil Rhodes and the shark. And, his point of view was that the shark was faster than the ship. And our point of view was that wool and war go together for money, for profit.
And that information about said war, especially prior information, would be enormously helpful. One
of the things that strikes me as I read the book is just the overwhelming scale of everything. As an average reader, I had no idea. you mention on pages 8 and 9 that, quote, entering World War II, the U.S. Army estimated needing 26 sheep to outfit one soldier one time. And I know you go into greater detail about the scale of production throughout the book, but were you surprised to learn these details, or did your backgrounds give you some kind of foreknowledge of that kind of thing?
I knew a little bit more probably than Trish did going into it, because what brought us into this was the Civil War project that I had worked on. And so I was aware of things like, how much wool was needed in the American Civil War, and the fact that the reason that we consider the word shoddy to be poor quality is that shoddy was originally only the textile industry term for recycled wool. And when the Civil War broke out and all of a sudden the Union Army, the U.S. Army, went from under 18,000 men to 500,000, manufacturers started adding a little more recycled wool, shoddy, to the mix of the yarns than they really should have. And it was a terrible series of scandals, and the uniforms were bad. And so that the shoddy scandals and all of the follow-up on that, following on of that, is kind of the lead up to needing a substitute for wool, because if you can't get it, you still have to clothe your armies. And what are you going to use?
I have to say, Madelyn's right that I had no idea about this at the beginning. I knew that in a letter my grandfather had written to Jeremiah Williams in Boston in 1915, my grandfather was aware that there was a lot of money to be made from wool in wartime, and that clearly relates to the scale of how much wool is needed. Australian Wool Innovation is an organisation here in Australia that commissioned us to make the first film that Madelyn referred to. And in 2018, Madelyn and I and a cinematographer went to the US Quartermasters Museum in Virginia. And I think for me, it was that visit. I think perhaps that's where we found one of the posters, because it was about 20 sheep per soldier in World War I and 26 in World War II. But it was a revelation in a way how absolutely dedicated the US quartermasters of the 20th century were to properly outfitting their soldiers, and how central wool was to that. Perhaps that was a learning from the shoddy scandals of the 19th century, but thinking of you lot in New England, the Arlington woolen mills, for instance, in Lawrence in Massachusetts, certainly in the First World War, and I think in the Second as well, making really quality woolen uniforms for US soldiers was absolutely central to the war effort. And so, of course, commodities that become important in wartime are commodities that will rise in value.
I love that you had brought up the origins of shoddy. I was going to ask you to talk about that a little bit. But it's very clear throughout the book that there are so many historical figures who have roles to play through the development of wool production. In chapter 2 alone, over the course of just a few paragraphs, you make reference to Edward III, the 100 Years' War, Pope Gregory IX and Pope Clement VII, the Crusades, Florence, the Medici family, and Henry VIII, to name a few. So you make it quite clear that sheep and wool and the revenues produced have played a major role over the centuries in creating fortunes and provoking intrigues and conflicts. But how long did it take you to figure out how to begin your research and how to tie all these things together? How many times did you find that you were unraveling something, pun intended, I guess, to discover that it led to something you weren't expecting?
Oh, gosh, every other day. I really do mean that. I think Trish and I mean, the whole thousands of emails thing is true, and also lots and lots of Zooming. But, we would find something and send it, and the other one would say, wait a minute, I've got this that relates to that. So we were doing separate regions, I guess, of research. But we found so many things that connected, and that was thrilling for one thing, but also surprising, I think. Just how many tentacles the wool industry had around the globe, and I guess for one, that what Trish and I were in outback Queensland, and we stopped at the Pioneer Park Museum, which is a sprawling volunteer-run place out in the middle of what we would consider pretty much nowhere.
Dolby, Queensland. It's not nowhere.
It's not on the main tourist route, let's put it that way. But in this little military shed was this little, like a typewritten piece of notepaper pinned to a dark green coverall behind some dusty glass. And I was like, it's a Japanese airman suit? How did it get here in World War, it's a World War II Japanese flyers coverall. And they let us take it out because behind the glass and through the dust, we were looking at this going, that looks like that can't be all wool. It's a little shiny. And anyway, they let us take it out. And we're like, there's rayon in here, and that was, I think, a key moment for us in 2019 of saying, whoa, I mean, we knew that rayon had been around and that it had been found a role during the interwar period, but we hadn't really understood or begun to understand or even thought about asking the question of how much of a role did rayon play in World War II. And that really set us off in a whole new direction. So that's just one example.
And just to add quickly to that, so Madelyn and I met in July 2014, structuring this book and really thinking of the arc of its argument. I think we did together in a coffee shop in Canberra, the capital of Australia, in August 2022, by which time we had realised, wow, we are not only talking about wool and war, we are talking about the history of where synthetics came from. And remarkably, nobody, to our knowledge, and we've done quite a lot of fossicking, it would appear that nobody has really undertaken in any global sense an account of where synthetics came from and how indeed that relates to wool and war. So that was certainly one of the things that has kept our interest for that 11 years. And I must say I retain a deep interest in textiles, is the things that we discovered along the way that opened up new horizons and new connections.
And that's a perfect segue to my next question, because you have a chapter called Ersatz and all that, which is essentially about the need to find substitutes for wool fiber. And so if you could summarize why this developed, why this needed to happen, what would you say?
I would say that the British blockaded Germany in World War I, and the Germans had a very strong woolen manufacturing industry and imported something over 90% of the wool that they needed to feed that industry. So they were blockaded. The British controlled who had access to wool. The U.S. and various other neutral countries were trying to sort of backdoor ship some wool to Germany, but it never really went very far because Britain also controlled a lot of the world's shipping. And it became just too difficult to get anything there. So the Germans and the Austrians had to come up with Ersatz, which is substitutes, the German word for substitute. And rayon, then called artificial silk, had been developed and really only became commercial in about 1912. But it was very shiny and very slick. It was very weak, and it was worse when it was wet, which, of course, if you're in a trench in World War I, you're wet a lot. They tried all kinds of other things. They experimented with milkweed fiber and with cattail fiber and with different kinds of chemical processes on jute, for example. But the really important discovery for them was that a twisted paper yarn that had been used primarily for things like cording and sacking and things like carpet mats, that kind of woven stuff. Before the war, they just went all in on this paper yarn because what did they have? They had forests, and the paper was easy for them to pulp and get into the manufacturing. And I knew a little bit about that before going into this, because when I worked at FIT in the 80s, we'd done a paper dress show, and I had found something about Germans wearing paper suits during World War I. And then I found 2 of those suits in the Newark Museum doing a collection survey for them. I couldn't believe it. And they felt like cloth. I mean, they're pretty amazing things. When I got to the Smithsonian American History Museum, I found that they had 40 or so military objects, things like bags for feeding horses and covers for entrenching tools and ammunition pouches and things, all made of this paper textiles. And I thought, oh my God, I mean, sending people to the Western Front in paper, and they lost, right? If you're going to go to war, you need to have the resources to support it. And when one country controls most of the wool, you have to find something else. And so in the interwar period, everybody who wanted wool and couldn't get it in World War I starts experimenting.
That's so interesting. And also sort of reminds us that there is a very human side to this. You have, the generals and politicians who are making decisions about what to spend money on and what to produce. But you do make reference throughout the book to the skilled labor that's required to produce wool and woolen clothing, especially prior to the mechanization processes that were ushered in during the Industrial Revolution. How much historical record is available that comes from primary or secondary sources about the lives of these skilled workers? Were you able to tap into too much of that kind of information?
There isn't all that much. We did find some stuff on the medieval wool trade. There's a little bit about that. There are a number of books, particularly in England, about the lives of people in the wool trade and what it encompassed. I think in Australia, Trish will have to speak to that, because that's largely the primary industry, but there was a wool manufacturing industry there that starts in the late 19th century and gets more important in the 20th century. And actually, they were making uniforms and blankets for American soldiers in the Pacific War during World War II was coming from Australia, because they already had the wool. They could make the stuff and have it there and ship it right to them, as opposed to having to come across the Pacific. But I would like to see, and I think in some instances it's too late, more oral history from mill workers. And there is some. It's not that there isn't any, but it's mostly related to like the big labor strikes in the teens and 20s and 30s. So I think that it would be great if there were more. It would be great if more like mill worker diaries or letters or journals or things like that could be found. I'd love to see it.
Yes, I would concur with all of that. Madelyn and I hope with this book that what we've done is lay out a coherent thread of argument which can be made thicker with more threads of other authors and researchers. When Madelyn was recently in Australia, and we had 7 wonderful events in different locations to launch our book. In South Australia, we presented in what had been the Onkaparinga woolen factory, and a lot of our audience there had been mill workers that were so interested and talked with such pride about that work in the woolen mill. So I would say that there's not a huge amount about that skilled labour in wool manufacturing in our book, but I think it could totally add to what we've done, and I look forward to seeing that.
Now, you do talk about what for me is a surprising connection between wool and microplastics and the trail that leads from one to the other. Hate to put you on the spot, but how optimistic are you based on your research that the microplastic tide can be turned?
Look, it's not going to be easy. 57% of the textiles in the market at the moment are polyester, and polyester, first known as terylene, comes out of British research in World War II. I think each and every one of us has to take responsibility for the textiles that we use and understand how many of them have been plastic. In the very latest figures, Australia is one of the absolute worst in the world, closely followed by the US. We're up the top of a league table of shame for buying huge amounts of textiles, something like 27 kilograms of textiles each year, and then, of course, discarding them. In Australia, as I understand in the US, fast fashion, much of it bought online, buying stuff that doesn't quite work and then throwing it away or even sending it to second-hand shops, it does not work. So I think a combination of individual responsibility with greater government regulation, and in Australia there's a lot of talk about such regulation, but the textile industry has been largely left to self-regulate, and I would say self-evidently that has failed. So I don't think we've got the luxury of despair. It's too important, but I think that education about textiles and about how I think people don't understand that synthetic textiles are an absolutely major source of microplastic pollution, that it can't go on at this scale, or if it does go on, we're going to be destroying the oceans upon which we depend.
I think that on that note, we will give our listeners something to think about, and we will move on to what we call the last chapter. So we wrap up the show with the last chapter where we talk about a library or bookish related question. And today I'd like to ask you, if you could go back in time to any historical period anywhere in the world to research and write a book about it, when and where would you go and why? And whichever one of you would like to jump in first, please do.
Boy, that is a real poser of a question, because I can think offhand of about 43 time periods and places I would love to go. But at the moment, having recently in Rhode Island lost the last Lever's lace mill that was active in the United States, and had the pleasure of going down and looking at it and looking at some of the machines working and things in its last days a few years ago. I would like to go back to 1912 and 13 when the Aldrich Tariff Act was written, Aldrich being the Rhode Island senator at the time. And he inserted into that Tariff Act a window of opportunity for the Lever's lace machines from Nottingham, England, to be imported duty-free. And many of them were imported, what a surprise, to Rhode Island, which then became the Lever's lace capital of the United States. And so I'd like to be a fly on the wall in that conversation.
And for myself, I'm just starting a project whose working title is Quenched, because I've enjoyed Fleeced. Quenched is going to be about the development of piped public drinking water, which comes out of the cholera and typhoid scourges, like, as urban areas, big urban areas develop in the US, in London, in the 1850s, and they're discovering that people are dying from water, and they don't have a coherent theory of germs. There's a doctor in London whose name I haven't yet learned, but who starts to understand that people around particular wells are dying. Anyway, fast forward about 15 years later, by the 1860s, they understand that they need to create safe repositories of water and pipe it into those cities. And by the mid-1860s, you've got public drinking fountains that are sculptural and grand and are kind of an ad for water. They're a failed design, because certainly the ones in Australia use a communal cup. They don't yet understand enough about germ theory to understand that a shared cup isn't going to be a great way of getting safe drinking water to the humans. So I would love to go back to the 1860s, jump on would still have been a sailing ship, go to London, across the Atlantic to New York, bring back, actually in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia, in the middle of our botanic gardens by the mid-1860s. There's one of these beautiful sculptures that was beautiful sculptural fountains providing water for humans and horses and dogs. And I would like to kind of, I might give them a clue that they need to change design quickly. Otherwise, those fountains are going to be strange kind of artifacts on the edges of cities all over the world, too important to toss away or, rub over, but not quite workable as a delivery system for water either. But free public water, not in plastic bottles, is so important.
Yes, and speaking of delivery systems, if time travel is ever developed, I hope you both get your wish. This has been a warm and woolly conversation. I've enjoyed it very much. Before we go, could you tell our audience where they can learn more about you, about FLEECED, how they can purchase the book, where to follow you online, things of that nature?
I'm a social media failure. So I have a LinkedIn profile, but that's about it. So I'm on there. And FLEECED can be ordered online, or I would recommend going to your local bookstore and having them order it for you, and then everybody wins. And we support local bookshops, which I think is really important.
Look, I think for Australian audiences, I could tell you the bookshops in key East Coast cities that are stocking our book, but I think Madelyn's given perfect advice. In terms of social media, I too have a LinkedIn profile that has some FLEECED content. Fabric of War was the original name of our project, and there is a publicly available Fabric of War website that includes, you can access our films, one of which was called Fabric of War, Why Wool, and that includes quite a lot of US content.
And also, if you just Google us, we come up because we've done a number of papers at different conferences, and some of those are online. The National Library, I had to do a fellowship talk at the end of that, and that's on YouTube. And also, we were interviewed at the National Library for our launch, our book launch, in July 31st, which was fabulous. And I think that is also online. That's on YouTube, but it was also edited down for Big Ideas on Radio National. So we're around if you look us up.
All right. Well, thank you both for joining me, and thank you everyone for listening.
And thank you for having us.
Thank you, Zach. Yes, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Indeed it has. If you'd like to respond to the last chapter topic of your favorite time travel writing idea, or just reach out to the show, send us an email at overdoingitpod@gmail.com, or find us on Instagram at overdoingitpod. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help us reach more Rhode Islanders. Overdoing It is proud to be a resident partner of the Rhode Island Center for the Book and is brought to you by library staff and community members all around the Ocean State. This project has been funded in part by the Rhode Island Office of Library and Information Services. Thank you again for listening. This has been another episode of Overdoing It, the Rhode Island Library Podcast. We're overdoing it, but you're doing just fine.
Thank you. See you, Zach and Dave, in Brisbane, Australia one day.
Thanks, Zach.
It's been a real pleasure.
Indeed it has.